Hi, everybody. My name is Jamie Motherall. I'm an API and functional testing subject matter expert and product marketing manager here at Parasoft. I'm very excited today for our session. On the line with us today, we have my colleague, Joanna. Joanna, did you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Joanna Schloss, and I am an AI and analytics subject matter expert and enthusiast. Here at Parasoft, I'm also the Chief Marketing Officer. Jamie and I will be spending the next 20 minutes talking to you about how AI can be used as a test automation time machine.
Okay, we're going to start with a quick agenda. We're going to start by having a discussion around what we call the time travel dilemma. So, that age-old problem, how do you balance speed versus quality? Then we'll talk about really the fuel for our time machine, which is AI. So, we'll look at a couple examples of AI-powered test generation, as well as how AI is helping teams to accelerate their testing feedback loops. From there, we'll go into some key takeaways and then finally our live Q&A.
So let's
Right.
get started. So Jamie and I are going to share our viewpoints on what this dilemma means, right? So what do you mean a time travel dilemma? So I've been in the software development lifecycle space for a long time, helping our API and microservices um, people basically build applications faster, right? So probably 10, 15 years ago, it all became about releasing faster. And people started to put quality to the side, right? And a lot of people actually thought they could just test quality into the products that they were building, which
Mhm.
created a conundrum for them, right? And everyone thought, well, if I could test faster, then I could create more quality. But if every test takes time, which takes away from time to build out quality products. So for me, this is always a push me, pull me conversation or a balanced conversation for all of my API developers, my developers at large around how do I build quality into products and test at speed. What about you, Jamie? What does the time travel dilemma between speed versus quality mean for you?
To me, it's about how to really empower the QA tester, that practitioner itself, because they're under so much strain nowadays with the rising complexity that we see across software. The way that systems are becoming more distributed, APIs, you see a heavy reliance on them. And the way that this is all kind of compounding that QA team, that QA practitioner, who now has to struggle with not only how do I create test cases that are more complex and more challenging to create, more difficult to maintain, how do I create them at speed and still hit my deadlines when it comes to a release? So, really, how can we take that pressure off of that QA practitioner is where I really like to focus.
That's a really good definition, and I'd love to hear more from you about how this complexity in the environment, right? Whether it's on the development side or on these testing side, how does that actually cover the need for both the developer and the testers to capture the functional requirements in the form of user stories, the
Mhm.
technical requirements that all APIs are required to abide by, and the requirements, the functional requirements that they're really trying to deliver.
One big challenge I see here is with that rising complexity. A lot of teams and the way that people have approached functional testing is reliance a little bit more on web UI testing, so end-to-end testing, integration testing, but it's more looking at the UI layers versus the API layers. And the challenge that we're coming up to now is that when you have this huge focus on web UI testing, over there, the user stories, the requirements of those test cases are easy to define. But as our applications are getting more complex with these distributed services, doing just web UI testing to validate these big workflows across multiple API steps in distributed systems, it's just not adequate. You need to do more thorough testing. So how can you do more thorough testing when you've got this rising challenge of complexity? Most people do not, if they're mostly familiar with the web UI side, they're not going to have that in-depth knowledge of what are the APIs doing under the hood and how do I actually create a test flow that is looking at the way that data is being passed from API step to API step to API step. So all of that rising complexity makes it so that, when it comes down to API testing, the user stories, those requirements are much more hard to define for your novice or your average tester.
And do you find that our QA testers, or our novice testers, or our learners, or even our like mature but more manual testers, is there a skills deficit that we're facing as
Mhm.
well?
There is, I see a lot of the times because I am fairly close with a lot of our customers across Parasoft. I came from the side of account management originally before I started to work more on being really a advocate and a specialist when it comes to API testing and functional testing. So, working with a lot of our customers and these practitioner groups, one thing that I would encounter quite often is there's a desire to scale up on API testing. They see the benefits attached to it. The fact that these test cases are more maintainable and resilient to change. These test cases will also execute faster, meaning they get faster feedback from their testing efforts. There's a lot of scalability challenges that are solved when you start to implement more testing at the API layers. But many teams are constructed where it's really a diverse skill set. They're going to have manual testers mixed in there with their web UI testers that really don't have that knowledge of what's happening with the APIs across their domain and how that data is being kind of flowing through the application at the API layers. So how is it that we can really bridge that gap of technical deficit that is at a lot of organizations? And that's one big thing about how AI can really help you to accelerate as well as make certain types of testing a lot more approachable for a lot of testers out there.
Absolutely. And then ultimately, do you think that there is an opportunity here for us to look at how much testing is being done? I come from a
Yes.
world where one of my favorite projects when I was at Sauce Labs was to look at test coverage models and see how many tests were being run and how
hmm
many of them could be put to the side, right? So, what are your thoughts on this, automation overload?
That is a great question because this is something that I see a lot of organizations struggling with. Every time a change occurs within their system, their strategy is to test everything again. And that
Right.
strategy only works to a certain extent until you reach a level of test maturity where you really can't do that anymore. Your test suite has grown to the point where there's too many test cases, and then in front of that too, you also have the added complexity and burden of test maintenance. When you have a huge suite of test cases where you're running, you want to be running 10,000 test cases, maybe more than that, per regression. Yeah, that's a long time to get that testing feedback. And then that's a lot of test cases to consistently have to look at to decide whether or not they need to be updated, they need to be maintained. And I have seen, in my own experience working with our customers, situations where people, for instance, will adopt like Selenium test framework to test their test suites.
Right, right. And so ultimately, this affects the business in the most
hmm
obvious way, which is you must have said 4 or 5 times more, longer, more time. And
hmm
it really impacts this tight deadline around staying competitive, releasing often, delivering new capabilities to customers and prospects. And ultimately, if they had a time machine, couldn't we go backwards in time and be able to build all those test requirements, run all those automated tests, and then also ultimately deliver a highly quality piece of software? Which brings us to the crux of this conversation, which is as the time has changed, next slide, AI might be the magic behind this. And if all of us could have a Harry Potter Hermione's time turner, wouldn't that be great? You could do all your testing as well as all the learnings, and take all those learnings and put them into the product as quality, right? Jamie's going to walk us through the next few slides that really talks about how in this modern age, AI really can be the fuel to your your testing time machine, right? So how can API testing benefit from AI? What's the practical approach and what's a realistic approach to something that looks a little bit like magic from the outside? Jamie?
All right, let's jump in. Now, for the sake of time, we're not going to be able to show technical demonstrations today, but I am going to take you through some examples of what these AI workflows look like. So we're going to start with talking about test generation from a traffic recording. We'll look at the SOA Test Smart API test generator. Now, the form of AI that we're looking at today is proprietary to Parasoft. This is something that we've built internally in-house. And it's all really designed to make API testing a lot easier for less technical testers, as well as help you to accelerate your testing by rapidly generating API test scenario test cases very quickly and easily. So we're going to start first by putting ourselves in the shoes of a manual tester or someone who's more typically a web UI focused tester. Traditionally, when you're testing through the web UI, you're not really thinking about the APIs and how they work or how they're used. The UI really already has that business logic built in, that it's abstracting those details and then orchestrating the series of API calls necessary to fulfill the needs of the UI workflow. But when a tester needs to write an API test against the system directly, they often encounter a lot of barriers where they don't know exactly the business logic that the front end was orchestrating. So what our AI does is we capture the network traffic while exercising the UI, and our AI model builds out a model of stateful data that needs to be extracted and parameterized so that the sequence of generated API tests will faithfully execute the business logic defined by that user interface flow. So basically, what we're doing here is automatically generating API test cases that perform and function and have the same workflow that's typically tested through the UI, and we're just running them at the API layer. Now, a couple things to point out here. When I say that we're capturing the network traffic, we actually do this in a number of ways. So we saw this manual testers workflow where they would use what we call our Parasoft Recorder. It's a plugin for Chrome, and they just have to go to the Chrome web browser, go to their web UI, hit a little button in the corner that says, I'm going to start the recording and go through their typical journey on the web UI. And then when they're done, stop the recording and they have that traffic file. Now, a nice thing about this is if you already have a suite of existing web UI test cases, and we don't care what those test cases are written in, what your test framework is. You could be using Selenium, you could be using Playwright. All you have to do is add a command to your execution scripts to say, execute on the Chrome browser and talk to Parasoft. And from there, you can actually generate an entire suite of complementary API test cases for your existing web UI test cases. There's a lot of benefits to this because keep in mind, when you talk about scalability, API test cases are much easier to maintain. They're less brittle in the face of change. And then also they're a lot faster to execute in comparison to web UI testing. So easier to execute, faster to get that feedback. So lots of great benefits there that help them to be more scalable in the long range of test maturity. Now, we can also gather this traffic from deploying a proxy between two different endpoints and recording the traffic that way. So there's quite a few different ways that you can generate this traffic file to be able to rapidly generate these API scenario test cases for your APIs that are browser-based or experience APIs, meaning they're right under the hood of your web UI application. Now, the next one that we want to talk about is going to be that LLM-based API test generation. So this is really nice, especially in instances of API first led development. all you really need for this is a service definition file and your tester to put together a command prompt. So it all starts within Parasoft again, so a test. It has an integration with a lot of popular LLM models out there. And as a QA tester, you would do absolutely no coding. Instead, you would sit down, you would fill out a requirements prompt in natural language. And this is just going to dictate to the AI engine what the test case should do and the functionality you're looking to validate. The user will then input that prompt with their API service definition file. So an open API, a Swagger definition. Keep in mind, service definition files are typically created in the early stages of API development. So these, as a best practice, should be something that your organization is creating and maintaining. And as soon as that definition file is available, you can actually start to use it to generate test scenarios. The AI will analyze the definition file with the user prompt, and it will begin to generate API scenarios, test cases that follow those specs outlined in the prompt. Those test cases are then scriptlessly added to the SOA test IDE and are ready to go as far as for automation. So very easy for you to get up and running very quickly with this, to build out a whole series of API scenario test cases, increase your test thoroughness and your test coverage, and all very rapidly with these two different forms of AI, the LLM-based test generation, and then that first native or proprietary AI example that we showed you with the SOA Test Smart API test generator. Now, the next thing I want to talk about here a little bit is accelerating testing feedback. And don't worry, there's no DeLorean required for this AI journey. Instead, we're going to be looking at AI-based test impact analysis. Um, Now, this might be a little contentious to say, but when we think about it, we've talked about these instances of AI helping to accelerate test creation, but that acceleration, has it really done a lot to move the needle when it comes down to ensuring that your applications are release ready? You might be able to say it's increased test thoroughness. We've been able to generate a lot more test cases, so thoroughness has increased. But I'm going to pause you for a second because, at the end of the day, in order to benefit from those test cases, you have to execute them. And really, what you've created with the AI is a much larger test suite to both maintain as well as execute. And that larger test suite is going to take more time, which is not what you want if you have these very intense, very aggressive release cycles that are very common in agile development today. So, test impact analysis is all about reducing the testing scope in a very intelligent and automatic way. So, instead of every time an application change occurs, you retest the entire application, you instead get to go, I am going to just execute the subset of test cases that directly correlate with the recent code changes that have occurred. So let's walk through how this works. It all starts actually with code coverage. So Parasoft supports gathering code coverage for Java and .NET applications. This is so for test impact analysis to work, that's really the only criteria. You have to have a Java application or a .NET application, and you have to be able to deploy our coverage agents. Now, oftentimes, you'll see a lot of organizations that they have no problem when it comes down to gathering unit testing coverage. Functional testing coverage from automated functional test cases, from manual test cases can be a lot more problematic. That's where Parasoft's coverage agents come in, where we're able to deploy them. And then anytime you're executing any of your functional test cases, automated or manual, we can gather up that coverage for you. We can then correlate it all together and provide you with an analysis of your complete application coverage. Now, that coverage data is used by test impact analysis. So it all starts with understanding exactly what each test covers. So what code does each test actually cover? From there, we do a diff. We need to understand what has changed. Now, when we do this code diff, it's from a baseline build where you last ran your full regression suite. But it's really up to you what that baseline build is. It could be yesterday, it could be a few days ago, it could be last week, even your last release. It's up to you what that baseline is. But we do that diff to be able to identify exactly what has changed. From there, it then correlates those changes to exactly the test cases that were impacted. And now, instead of your QA team having to wait to validate changes to run a full regression suite and get that test feedback from that full regression run, your team is much more agile. They're able to validate their changes, application changes in sprint and address those because they'll get rapid feedback. Now, this is something that Parasoft has implemented across our solutions. So we have it currently within our JTest and our dot test solution for CI processes for unit testing. In the Java side, we actually have it integrated into IDE as well for locally executing unit tests automatically to validate code changes every time a change occurs. And then we also have it built into our SOA test solution for API testing and end-to-end testing and our Selenium testing solution called Selenic. But we take it even a step further because at the end of the day, we don't care about what test framework you're using. You could be using anything. At the end of the day, it all comes down to, do our code coverage agents support you? If it's Java, if it's .NET, then yes, they most likely do. And we'll be able to gather that code coverage that is required for us to run test impact analysis. So we don't care about what you might be using to do your integration testing, to do your end-to-end testing. We can deploy those coverage agents, gather that information for you, and then within your CI process, strategically help you to identify exactly what test cases need to be executed to validate the changes. Um, this also supports microservices architectures. And this is kind of going back to our discussion that we had earlier about rising test complexity. This rising challenge of having so many distributed architectures. How do you ensure that everything is thoroughly tested when everything is so distributed? And how do you also validate those changes? It's very difficult to manually identify exactly what downstream microservices are impacted by application change. But with our coverage ability, our ability to gather that code coverage and then correlate those test cases, even in distributed systems, we can identify exactly what those downstream changes have been and then what test cases correlate to them so that we can then say, this is just the subset of test cases you need to execute. So big impact there when it comes down to microservices architectures. So let's now look at an example of test impact analysis in the wild. Here at Parasoft, we like to say we drink our own champagne. And what you'll see on the left is an example of a full CI run of one of Parasoft's projects. So you'll notice that we've got 4,000 to 4,500 test cases consistently being executed. And this was before we started to implement test impact analysis. On the right, you will see that it's actually gone down from being in the thousands to being in the hundreds. So we've dropped to zero. So we have actually shrunk it so that when we run our test cases, we're not executing our entire regression test suite every time. We still do our regression testing before major releases, but what we do instead is we run test impact analysis and we're able to validate those changes in sprint instead. So you'll see it has moved from executing 4,500 test cases routinely to now 50 to 75 test cases, so just a handful. And when we think about the acceleration that this has provided us, we've really been able to shrink our testing feedback time from hours to minutes. So our teams are much more agile. They're much easier for them to take action and get their testing results right away. Um, so uh, We are running a little bit behind on time, so I'm going to turn it on over to Joe. She's going to walk you through some of our key takeaways for today's presentation.
Right. Our key takeaways are really AI is that time machine. As Jamie mentioned a moment ago, de-risking deployment is a key, right? Through increased test coverage, because you know you've covered, tested more parts of the code than ever before. And I can tell you, we surveyed 3,000 developers, and they said the scariest moment of their day is when they hit that deploy button, right, on top of a master branch merge. We want to really, extend our skills, right? Increase the approachability of API testing within teams. Help all of our testers, whether they're manual QA testers or SDETs, be able to start to test every part of that API. Ensuring high quality microservices, right? Using TIA, you can start to look at the impact of upstream code changes and see how which of the microservices are actually affected, and take care of them before you hit that deploy button. Being able to keep pace with agile development, that was that whole conversation about tight deadlines, right? These microservices, these applications are going out the door faster and more often. And ultimately, we can only do that with faster feedback loops, right? We want to deliver
Exactly.
quality, and the only way to deliver quality is to know where our defects, our bugs, and our risks are.
Exactly.
That. I'm going to thank Jamie Motherall, and my name's Joanna Schloss, and turn it over to all of you to have a really lively Q&A. If you're interested in trying one of our products, feel free to snap that QR code and check out our website, or you can always request a custom demo, and we'd be happy to chat with you about our products and how we actually deliver this amazing AI time machine capability, today and in person.